You see what I mean? You know how we often say that? You're following a mathematical proof, and the conclusion comes out clearly, and you say, oh, I see what I ought to have done. Huh? Yes, seeing abstractly, not with reference to sense particulars, but with reference to some abstract line of thought. You see? We say it again and again. Well, look at this excerpt from The Republic. Everybody have a copy? Okay, it's from Book 7 of The Republic, in the context where the cave analogy appears. Conceive, said I, that there are these two entities. One of them is sovereign over the intelligible order, and the other over the world of the eyeball. Okay, the sensory world. So this, then, is the sensory world, the world of the eyeball and the other senses, and this is the intelligible world. Okay, intelligible sense world. The visible and the intelligible. Now, represent them, as it were, by a line divided into two unequal sections. Two unequal sections, all right? Make this one a little bit longer. And cut each section again in the same ratio, all right? And you've got a line divided into four parts, Plato's famous divided line. Okay. The section of the visible and that of the intelligible. And then as an expression of the ratio of their comparative clearness and obscurity, you will have as one section of the visible world, all right, as one section, images. Images. That is, shadows, reflections in the water, or on surfaces, things of that kind. Okay? Images, shadows, illusions, hallucinations, okay? Imaginations, if you like, where you fantasize something, picturing to yourself something which doesn't exist physically. Okay? The second section, assume that of which this is a likeness or an image, that is, animals, plants, and the whole class of man-made objects. So here you've got physical particulars. Okay, physical particulars. Okay. And then what you do in the higher region is something similar. You make a distinction, as he puts it, such that there is one section which the soul is compelled to investigate by treating as images the things imitated in the former division and by means of assumptions, images and assumptions, from which it proceeds to the conclusion. And another section in which it advances from its assumption to a beginning principle. All right, so here you've got, if you like, first principles, okay, and here you've got the reasoning and making of inferences. And as he goes on, he points out that it's in this area of reasoning and making inferences that mathematics fits, which of course is making inferences, reasoning things out all the time, so that mathematical objects like mathematical relationships, like addition and so forth, come out there. But as we know from Euclidean geometry onwards, all mathematical systems and inferences depend on first principles. First principles which are assumed in the inference. Okay? So now what we have is to distinguish correspondingly the different kinds of awareness. Okay? If you take those images to be real, that's what we call illusion. This, dealing with physical particulars, is what we call sense perception. Those are the two kinds of opinion. Doxa, the Greek word. Opinion, seeming, appearance, the Greek verb dokeo. And up here you have, of course, deductive reasoning, deduction, that kind of thinking. And here, knowledge of first principles is by dialectic. Knowledge of first principles by dialectic. Okay, so that's the thing that he introduces. Now, halfway down the second page in this handout, he comes to talking about dialectic. Understanding that by the other section of the intelligible, I mean that which reason lays hold of with the power of dialectic. Now, what is dialectic? It treats its assumptions not as absolute beginnings, but as hypotheses, underpinnings, footings, springboards, that enable it to rise to that which requires no assumption and is the starting point of all. And after attaining to that, again, taking hold of the first dependencies and so proceeding downward to the conclusion. This is dialectic. And he goes on. It's no slight task that you have in mind. I understand that you distinguish reality and the intelligible contemplated by dialectic as something truer and more exact than the object of arts and sciences whose assumptions are arbitrary. Okay? Those who contemplate them are compelled to use understanding and not the senses. They go back to the beginning, the foundations in the study. And then at the top of 747, your interpretation is sufficient, so that answering to these four sections, you have intellection or reason for the highest, understanding or thinking things through for the second, belief or perceptual belief for the third, picture thinking, conjecture or illusion if you take it in as reality for the fourth. Okay. Well, and then the other two paragraphs are added from a little later in the text. Is not dialectic the only process of inquiry that does away with hypotheses, advances to the first principle itself? It's true that when the eye of the soul is sunk in the barbaric slough of Orphic myth, dialectic gently draws it out, leads it up, employing as helpers, cooperators, the studies and sciences we've enumerated, so forth. And then in what remains, we give the name dialectician to the man who's able to exact an account of the essence of each thing. Will you not say that the one who's unable to do it, capable of rendering an account to himself and others, doesn't possess full reason and intelligence about the matter? But the man who is able, so forth, is different. So notice the description he gives in the final paragraph. As it were in battle, running the gauntlet of all tests, striving to examine everything by essential reality and not opinion. He holds on his way through all this without tripping up in his reasoning. The man who lacks this power doesn't really know the good itself or any particular good. So you see, dialectic is analysis of argument and of idea, looking for consistency, looking for something which doesn't beg any question, which has no prior assumptions, scrutinizing it relentlessly, facing every objection, every other competitor, every counter-argument, you see. And if it survives that test of careful, honest, relentless dialectic, then you can be pretty sure you've grasped the truth. Now, that's Plato's account of dialectic. And with the rest of what we've been doing, it tells us what he thinks of knowledge. Do you get it? What do you think of it? Feedback? Questions? Yes, David. Yeah, we'll look at that a bit more later on. He seems to think that it's only at death that we get the full vision of the sun, which in the analogy is the most ultimate reality, the source of being, the source of light. Yeah, so that that full understanding comes later. And incidentally, that becomes the basis for the development of certain mystical traditions when Platonism was taken over in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and the sun becomes likened to God. So the vision of God, the mystical vision, you see. Is it possible in this life, in a limited way? Does it await the hereafter? Fully, yes. Yeah, Carl. Yeah, I think he would say we're living in a world of images, illusions, particulars. We simply don't get back to ultimate first principles. Our society hangs not on the knowledge of some ultimate, eternal, unchanging good, but on some social contract, you see. Yeah, I think he'd talk that way. It would not be Plato's ideal republic in which we live. Right. Yeah, Jason. No, is it Jason? Tim, okay. Yes. Right. Yes, he does, and we'll look at it when we get down to talking about the human soul. The Phaedo, which you're reading, part of, the full Phaedo gives a whole series of arguments for both the pre-existence and the immortality of the soul. You may know, incidentally, that in the early church, there were three views that were debated concerning the origin of the individual soul. Either the Platonic view that it pre-existed, or the view that it was somehow reproduced with physical procreation, or that it is a special creation of God at some point in fetal development. Curiously, the first was characteristic of Plato and a Platonic influence, the second of the more of the Stoics, and the third seems to have been separately introduced. So the history of theology in that way is very much indebted to the Greek tradition, very much. But we'll get back to that as we get to the human soul. Yeah, Tim.
What is recollection to the
Yeah. Okay. Dialectic, recollection of innate ideas. Yes, dialectic is the means, the method employed, okay, that facilitates recollection of innate ideas about those first principles. Get it? So recollection is seeing with the eye of the mind, whereas dialectic is how we get our minds into the position to be able to see. Okay? If you like, dialectic is focusing the mind. Focusing the mind. Jess?
I'm not sure if I still understand if there's a great difference in necessarily the approach. Like, let's say from the Sophists, who was mainly rhetoric, to the dialectic you see, like the Sophists.
Yeah.
Was that the difference that you're seeing? Or and did that translate into actual knowledge? Were they really believing, broadly speaking, really different things, or was just their approach to that knowledge the different?
Yeah. No, if you go back to the differences in ethical matters which we saw emerging in the pre-Socratics, those are the differences which Plato would say are represented here. That is to say, if we understand the first principles of moral order, okay, we'll have to think about the principle of justice. And he tries to define what justice is as a result of dialectical inquiry in the Republic. But meantime, what were some of the Greek poets interested in? And they weren't interested in the moral order of justice, you see. What are the Sophists after? What are they talking about? Well, in the materials we have, take a look at Democritus again, where Democritus was saying, yeah, be savvy, use your head, but in order to ensure pleasure rather than pain, in order to be successful, in order to enjoy life, get ahead. Now, those were the kinds of values which are represented down here, the values associated with this world. Now, you can see immediately, I suspect from that, why this had such an appeal to a religious thought. Christian, Jewish, later on Islamic. You see? It's as if Plato was saying, set your affection on things above, not on things below. Yeah. And as we get to the early church fathers, we'll see that Plato was their principal resource in resisting non-Christian criticisms in those first 3-4 centuries. And indeed, I think as a result of assimilating it into Christian thought, Platonism was the dominant philosophical influence within Christianity until 1200, 1100, thereabouts. Yeah. And you can see its appeal right away.
You mentioned Alan Bloom last week.
Yes.
Suggested he's also calling us back to first principles. And would you comment on how you see Christian higher education in that role as opposed to
Yeah. Well, I think what Alan Bloom is doing is calling us back to the kind of liberal education through a study of the classics for which University of Chicago is famous. That is to say, while his criticism is that the contemporary university student talks as if there is no such thing as truth or falsity, right or wrong, by the time you get to the end of the book and he talks about his prescription for our society and for education, he's talking about reading all of the classics back to the Greeks and so forth. Now, why? It's not that you find one set of unchanging values. I mean, if you go through the great books, you find a whole variety of different things. A potpourri, it's a regular cafeteria assortment. You see. No, I think what he is after is a dialogue that would go on with those great books. If you like, kind of informal dialectic with those alternatives that would lead people to ask basic questions, even though they might disagree on the conclusions. They'll be trying to get back to first principles. You see. Well, you know, I see Christian liberal arts education very much related to that. Liberal arts education involving us in dialectic dialogue with the great minds and great ideas of the past and the present, while all the time looking at those ideas from the perspective of the Christian faith and trying to see the relationship. Yeah. On the other hand, I think there is a kind of education that is much more the rhetorical kind, that teaches you the tricks of the trade so you can get ahead in your chosen vocation. You see, that's more the rhetorician's kind. Yeah. Okay, a couple of other things to round out this picture of his epistemology, and we'll pick up on these later on. You might gain the impression from what I've said that Plato thinks of the pursuit of knowledge and the exercise of dialectic as a detached, unimpassioned, purely objectified kind of intellectual exercise. Not so. Not so. You find that Plato talks a lot about love of the good, and of course in the intellectual realm, love of truth. Because the question is, what are the psychological dynamics involved in getting a person to focus attention on first principles, rather than on the titillating, fascinating particulars that absorb us for most of our lives? And in the symposium, therefore, you find, for instance, the whole dialogue devoted to the question, what is love? It's interesting. What is love? Now, the word that he's using is the word eros, desire. Now, the word eros and its cognates erotic in our day have narrowed down in their reference to sexuality, but not so among the Greeks. Eros was simply the kind of love that wants, that desires. And when he talks of an eros for the good, it means love of what is good, a desire to know what's good, love of truth, a desire to know what's true. You see, a love of wisdom, a love of beauty. You're going to be reading the Phaedrus next week, another of his dialogues. And you'll find the dialectic versus rhetoric theme coming out in the second part of the Phaedrus, powerfully. What constitutes good rhetoric as against not so good rhetoric? It's rhetoric guided by knowledge gained through dialectic. You see. But how do you get people to seek that? You see, to seek the good? There must be a love of the good, a love of beauty. And that in turn raises the question, what can be done to get people to love? You see. In a way, it is a vicious circle. If only you could grasp the vision of the good, the beautiful, in its ideal, in principle, grasp it with your mind, you would love it. Yeah, but how can I grasp it if I don't love it? Get the vicious circle? It takes love to see with the eye of the mind. But how can I love what I don't see? Unless there is an unsatisfied hunger, a desire, an eros, in that sense. In the Republic, Plato makes, I think, two suggestions that he works with in a variety of places. One is that it's the task of the city-state so to order the good society as to encourage that sort of pursuit of the good.